Good morning, everybody. I am joined by my friend and my representative in the Minnesota House of Representatives, Frank Hornstein. He represents the 61st A district, which is kind of South Minneapolis and maybe a little bit of the park, maybe a little bit of Edina, I'm not sure. But he is a specialist in transportation, climate, energy, and I also see from his website preventing homelessness, which is an increasing problem. And I've known Frank for many years, especially through the work of my wife, Linnell, who works in politics, but also because he's married to my friend and colleague, Rabbi Marcy Zimmerman at Temple Israel. And he is here to tell us an important story or series of stories, and to tell us why it's important. You guys probably don't know, but tonight at sundown, the Yom Ha Shoah, the Day of Remembrance of the Holocaust, begins. And tomorrow in Israel, and maybe in some places in the United States too, an air raid siren will sound all over the country, and people will, I've heard they stop their cars and they get right out of their car and they stand next to the car in the middle of the freeway for 2 minutes and nobody says anything. And they just think or pray or cry in remembrance of the 11 million people, of whom 6 million were Jews, who were killed in Hitler's Germany and in the camps that the Germans ran in Europe. So it happens that both of Frank's parents survived the Holocaust, the Shoah. And if they hadn't, he wouldn't be here, obviously. So I've invited my friend to tell us about that. I've got some questions for him. But first, I'd like everybody to, even if this is artificial, I'd like everybody to give a warm welcome to Representative Frank Hornstein.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This means a lot to me to be able to speak to the students, especially on this very, very important holiday. It's not really a holiday in the traditional sense. It is more a day of remembrance and a day of reflection. And so I think that for us tonight and this evening is a day for us to reflect on the Holocaust and its lessons. And so I'm looking very forward to sharing my insights with you. Again, thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you here. So let's start at the beginning. Tell us about your mom and dad and who they were, where they lived, and what happened to them, and how they escaped. And take your time. Tell us the story.
Sure. Well, both of my parents, as you mentioned, are survivors of the Holocaust, and they had different experiences, but similarly lost both of their parents and many of their brothers and sisters and extended family. In the case of my mother, she grew up in Poland, a town called Lvov, which is now in the Ukraine. That part of Poland has switched back and forth between Ukraine and Poland and the Habsburg Empire over many years in the 20th century. But then it was a Polish city. And she has very clear memories of September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis bombed many of the major cities in Poland. That was really the beginning of World War II in Europe, September 1st, 1939. Air raid sirens went off. She had to scramble to get into a safe place. There were fires all over the place. What's that?
How old was she?
On that, she was 14 years old, just about 14. And so, imagine as a teenager, going about your daily business, all of a sudden you hear air raid sirens, bombs start falling, fires start raging. This was her experience on the first day of the war. The Nazis did not end up occupying her town until 1941. The Russians came in, and that was also a very difficult experience for her family. But once the Nazis came, then her father was taken away. She was forced into a part of the town where the living conditions were terrible. It was known as a ghetto. The Nazis did that in many of major cities and even smaller communities throughout Poland and throughout areas they occupied. She worked in a forced labor situation around the ghetto, and was then fortunate enough to secure false papers. Your identity was your life, and if your identity card said that you were Jewish, then very, very bad things awaited you. And but she was able to get a false paper that indicated that she was not Jewish, and then through an arrangement that was made, she took a train again as a teenager. She was going to go with her brother, but her brother disappeared on the way to the train station and had to go alone. He was, I think, found out and killed. Of course, she never saw her parents again after this. And so her father had already been taken away. And so she took a train by herself, posing as a Polish maid from Lvov to Warsaw. On the train compartment, someone said to her, "Boy, I could smell a Jew a mile away." A Nazi soldier said that. They passed a concentration camp and said, that's where they take the Jews. So she thought she was found out, but in the end, he did not report her, didn't suspect her. So she hid out in Warsaw in a situation not too dissimilar from Anne Frank. And she was with her cousin. They moved from place to place. In 1944, there was an uprising. There was a Jewish uprising in 1943 in Warsaw, Poland. In 1944, there was a uprising of Polish partisans who were fighting the Nazis. She signed up with them and fought against the Nazis in the streets of Warsaw. She told me one story where they were in the sewers to try to avoid the Nazi troops. The Nazis knew that there were fighters in the sewers, and they started throwing grenades into the sewers. And people all around her died. She was injured, but survived that. In another instance, the Nazis bombed the headquarters of where the uprising offices were, or positions were. And I don't think there were offices, but there were people hiding out in a particular building that I think served as the headquarters. Again, people around her died. She survived. At the end, she was with a group of people that just left Warsaw. They were wandering around the countryside. There was chaos all over the place. And a few days later, a Russian soldier came up on a motorcycle, and she was liberated. So my father's story is different, but has many similarities. He grew up in Hungary. Lvov is a large city in Poland. My dad grew up in a town called Hojdynanos, which is a small town, a small rural community in the northeast plains of Hungary, and actually not terribly far from Lvov. It's about an 8 to 10 hour train ride, but the Nazis came to Hungary in 1944, March 19th, 1944, at which time his brother and father were conscripted, and several of his brothers, were under different circumstances, were either conscripted or sent to different concentration camps and forced labor camps. His mother and sister were taken to Auschwitz, where they were killed in the gas chamber. My father had a medical education, so at the forced labor facility where he was taken, one day the commandant knew that he had a medical, had finished 1 year of medical school, and wanted him to go to Budapest to pick up a drug prescription for him. But he did that under guard. at the Budapest train station, where it was very crowded, my dad said, "This is my chance. I'm going to escape." So he escaped his captors, and then was wandering around the countryside, and again stopped by Nazis, and they suspected him, and he did have an ID card that indicated that he was part of the civil defense of the small town. The civil defense involved going up to the top of the church steeple and ringing the bell to warn people if enemy planes were approaching, which I never quite understood, because by the time you did that, I think the planes would have come and gone. That's small town Hungary. So again, there's many stories about his survival, but this is one of my favorites, where they stopped him, and he said, "I'm not Jewish. Here's my ID card that says I'm part of the civil defense." And they were very suspicious again. And then he said to them, "Do you think they would trust the security of this town to a Jew? I mean, come on." And then they looked. I think he convinced the soldiers at that point that he was okay. Again, I know we're running short on time, but I'll just simply say that he ended up hiding out in he befriended on the road a non-Jewish farmer, and let the farmer let him hide in his barn for the duration of the war. And then he was liberated also by the Russians. The Russians suspected my dad of being a Nazi, so they arrested him. And but he found a Russian soldier who was Jewish, and they spoke Yiddish to one another. And the Russian said, "He's cool." So I will just fast forward very quickly. Again, many other stories that come to mind. I mean, I just remembered this one. My mother, some Nazis had suspected that my mother and her cousins were Jewish, and they went and knocked on their door in Warsaw at one point, and there was a cat in the house that distracted the soldier, and then he left. Right? I mean, so they were very smart and lucky. I think to survive, you have to think on your feet and to have some luck. So I just wanted to end the piece about my parents with the story about how they met, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
They both left Poland and Hungary after the war because they knew the Russians were occupying those areas, and it was going to be a very difficult situation for them. So they escaped both at different times into Austria, and then from there, my father went to what's called a displaced persons camp, which is essentially a refugee facility in Germany, a town called Deggendorf, which is near Munich in Bavaria, for those of you who might be familiar with Germany. So he had already been at that place, and my mother was instructed to go there because she had a distant relative there. And so my mother was on her way there, and my father was on his way there. It was commuting back and forth to Munich to take medical school classes. So on the train from Munich to Deggendorf, they were sitting in a compartment together, and they each thought one another was a German because they were both speaking German to people around them. Then at one point, some Jewish kids were arguing about something in Hebrew, and my mother turned around and then corrected them. That's not right what you're saying. And so my dad said, "Wait a minute, you're Jewish? And I thought you were German." And my mom said, "Yeah, I'm Jewish. I thought you were German." And so the romance happened on the train and at the refugee camp. And that's how my parents met.
Oh, so were you born in Germany?
No, I was born in Ohio, and they came to the United States in 1952. They got a medical education in Germany. And so they came to Ohio because they had a very close friend in Ohio that helped my dad get a job at the medical school there. And Ohio happened to be a place where it was easier for immigrants to find work in the medical profession. They survived because there were Christians that hid them. And, my mom was hidden by nuns at one point. there was this Christian guy in Hungary. I didn't really highlight the fact that, like when my dad was hiding out on the farm, that was like a Christian guy, so that, we all have a responsibility to each other, and that these people took tremendous risks. Yeah. And if it wasn't for Christians, my parents wouldn't have survived, courageous, righteous Christians.
Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, I just want you to keep going. Talk about, if you would, about yourself and what it meant for you. And I can't remember if you have siblings, but for you and, and your family to have survived such a horrible trauma, and you didn't have grandparents or aunts or uncles that you could hang out with. Did you think about it a lot? Did they talk about it a lot? I'm just interested in the trauma, and also the happiness too in your family.
Sure. Well, thank you. That's a very, very good question. You mentioned the grandparents, and that's very important, because I think this was the first inkling that I realized I might be different from some of my other friends. I think I might have been 4 or 5 years old, and I had a friend up the street named Billy, and his grandparents were always around. So I'd go to his house, and his grandparents were around. So I do have this very clear memory of one day asking at the dinner table, I think, Billy's got grandparents. Like, do I have grandparents? And, my mom just, without a beat, without any hesitation, didn't miss a beat, said, yeah, you do, but they died in a war, and so I was like, okay. And then the other piece is that, and you might be of the generation, to play with these toy soldiers, these little plastic soldiers. And exactly. And that was my conception of war. Oh, so they were they were plastic soldiers. Okay. Because I'm 4 or 5 years old. I'm not that, but then I realized, I remember thinking that like, that doesn't quite add up for my grandmother, because there weren't any women soldiers. So, it's kind of, that whole thing was like a mystery to me, but that was the explanation. My parents had very thick foreign accents. And so I kind of knew again that they were from a different place than the rest of my friends. But, as I got older, I started putting 2 and 2 together. And I think sometime around junior high school, I realized, yes, that there was something called the Holocaust, and my parents survived it. And at that point, I got very curious about their story. And in college, I went around and decided to interview them and my relatives that survived, so that I could have their stories and keep them for the next generation. Now, I would say their experiences influenced me profoundly. That is why I decided to choose a career in public service, first as a community organizer and then an elected office. Very interested in environmental issues. That was something that was going on at the time, and still is, of course, but the modern environmental movement as we know it happened when I was, growing up. And the first Earth Day, that's coming up now in several weeks. But, sensitivity to immigration, sensitivity to racial justice. These are all things that I think were just handed down to me, because my parents' experience is that, in a society where things are, racism is not confronted, anti-Semitism is not confronted, really bad things can happen. And so I think I learned that consciously and unconsciously growing up, and had tremendous impact on the choices I've made as an adult in terms of my work and my values and how I view the world.
And so now you're obviously all grown up, and your kids are all grown up like ours are. And you probably have wishes. You probably have hopes for the next generation. It's been 80 years since these events happened. And I'm quite certain that the stories you've told already in chapel are news to many of our students, although they certainly study the Holocaust and World War II. I don't want to put words in your mouth like you're afraid of something, but are you concerned, or do you do you have thoughts about the future, about how well this will be remembered and how well the next generation either will or won't learn from lessons of what happened to your mom and dad?
I think about this and I'm concerned about this all the time. I believe that we are at a very, very important moment in the history of our country, that we have seen the rise of extremism, of hate groups that are organized. My parents just valued democracy so much after their experience, and felt and really for them, America really was a promised land of sorts. And I often think, what would they have been thinking on January 6th when the Capitol was stormed, when there was a violent insurrection, a coup attempt, where people who were inside the Capitol in Washington, D.C., one of whom was wearing a shirt that said Camp Auschwitz. There was someone else that was parading around a Confederate flag. We know that some of the people that fomented and participated in that insurrection do have ties to these Nazi-like extremist organizations. So what would they have possibly been, could they have ever imagined that in the United States of America, there would be an attempt at a violent coup, an overthrow of the government that would include elements of Nazi ideology? It was unheard of. I don't think they could have ever conceived that. Could we have even conceived of that? And even though the seeds have been sown for many, many, many years for this type of activity, and so I think that we're still at a very fragile place in our democracy and in our country, and that there are so many efforts that are still underway to subvert our democracy, that these groups, these armed militia groups, are still out there. And so I think it's all of our responsibility to stand up against it. When we have a hate crime as heinous as a couple of weeks ago in Atlanta, where Asian American women were gunned down because of their identity. We have, a synagogue, we had a mass shooting. That was the worst crime against Jews in the history of the United States. That just took place a couple of years ago. We have had fire bombings of mosques, one in Bloomington, and just continued hate crime after hate crime. Trans women of color, LGBTQ+, Black Americans, Latinx Americans. We had a shooting at a Walmart in El Paso targeted at Latinx community. So we are all in this together. And an attack on one group of people because of their identity is an attack on all of us. And so I think that the lesson of the Holocaust to me is that we remember that we have to honor the memory of those who died, my grandparents, my uncles, my aunts, many cousins. I think about them, I honor them, and we can never forget that this experience happened. And again, there's many, many people that trivialize the Holocaust, that deny that it happened. I see every single possible event and compared to it. There is no comparison to this crime. But we do have so many ways in which we can honor and remember their memories. And let's not forget about America's own history here. We had a genocide and a continuing issue with the indigenous community. That is a genocide that was perpetrated in our own neighborhoods, right? In the soil we sit on, the soil we sit on. We have had internment camps in this country for Japanese Americans, and we had a Chinese Exclusion Act. We actually had a law that excluded Chinese people from entering this country, and not to mention Jim Crow and slavery, and that legacy which continues to this day. So I think that when it comes to genocide and when it comes to racism and xenophobia and anti-Semitism and all of the ways in which people are persecuted for their identity. These are ongoing issues that I think the Holocaust teaches us to be very attentive to.
Great. Well, we're out of time, guys. We're going to, in a minute, we're going to have a closing prayer, and we're going to observe those 2 minutes. But before we do, Representative Frank Hornstein, thank you so much for your service to our little corner of Minneapolis and for the underrepresented people of the state and all those people who are left on the sidelines because of who they are, or worse than being left on the sidelines. So thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you so much for having me, and a blessed Holy Week and Ramadan and Passover to all who celebrate.